The rejection should have been just another moment of cold indifference for Kong Tae-sung. Another predictable exit from a woman who couldn't stomach the dark rumors or the icy silence of his bedroom. But when Nyla Bennett didn't recoil as he stepped into the doorway, something ancient and hungry stirred beneath his disciplined exterior. He had conquered empires for less than the challenge he saw flickering in her deep brown eyes. "Are you going to stand there like a statue, or are you going to sit down?" Her voice was steady, a sharp contrast to the trembling apologies he was used to. Tae-sung's hand tightened around the white silk fabric he held, his knuckles turning white. He was a man shaped by ruthless control, yet her calm gaze made him feel dangerously unanchored. He stepped closer, expecting her to flinch, to look away, to show the reflexive fear that had defined his every intimate encounter for years. Instead, she tilted her head, watching him with a curiosity that cut through his armor. For the first time in his life of ruling the Seoul underworld, Tae-sung felt a terrifying lack of power. "I don't take orders," he whispered, his voice a low, lethal vibration. "And I don't give them to men who are afraid to be seen," she countered, and the world shifted between them. Nyla had worked as an art consultant for Tae-sung's private collection for 3 months without ever truly meeting the man behind the shadow. To her, he was a legend whispered in high-rise galleries. Expensive watches, silent corridors, the scent of sandalwood, and a reputation for coldness that chilled the air long after he'd passed. She knew the professional boundaries. He bought only the best, never questioned her invoices, and demanded absolute discretion. Discretion was Nyla's sanctuary. Years of navigating the elite art world as a black woman had taught her the value of being an observer, alert, elegant, but always keeping a safe distance. She moved through marble halls like a ghost, perfecting the art of being essential without being vulnerable. Tonight, that careful distance evaporated. She was supposed to be cataloging the new acquisitions, but the heavy rain and a late-night security lockout had trapped her in the penthouse. She had made herself comfortable on the satin sheets of the guest suite, her dark curls tousled, a book forgotten by her side. She hadn't expected him to return early. She hadn't expected him to be half-dressed, looking less like a CEO and more like a warrior from a forgotten age. Every other woman in her position would have fled or fumbled for an excuse. But Nyla saw the way his shoulders stayed tense, the way his eyes searched hers for a fear that wasn't there. He was a man who ruled by fear, and he was clearly drowning in the silence of someone who wasn't afraid. She needed this contract to finalize her own gallery's lease. She needed the stability he represented. But as Tae-sung stood in the frame of the door, Nyla realized she wasn't just looking at a client. She was looking at a king who had no idea how to be a man. And for the first time in 8 days of rain, Nyla decided she wasn't going to move. To the world outside the reinforced glass of his penthouse, Kong Tae-sung was a myth carved in ice. He was the man who had consolidated the fractured factions of the Seoul underworld before his 30th birthday, a feat accomplished through a terrifying mixture of surgical precision and absolute silence. In the boardroom and the back alley alike, his presence was a physical weight, a suffocating gravity that forced men to lower their eyes. He was the king of shadows, a man who dealt in the currency of fear and never overpaid. But within the silent, sprawling luxury of his private sanctuary, the crown sat heavy in a way his subordinates would never understand. Tae-sung walked toward the floor-to-ceiling window, the city lights reflecting off his bare chest, highlighting the faint, jagged scars of a life lived on the edge of a blade. He looked at his reflection and saw a weapon, highly polished, lethally efficient, and profoundly alone. The history of his private life was a series of closed doors. There had been many women, daughters of business allies, starlets seeking the thrill of danger, women who claimed to want the man behind the legend. But the legend was all he knew how to be. In the rare, vulnerable moments behind silk sheets, his intensity was too much. His touch, though disciplined, carried the ghost of the violence he commanded. He had seen it time and again, the way their eyes would eventually dart toward the exit, the way they would shrink from his shadow as if they realized, too late, that they were trying to tame a hurricane. The most recent rejection still tasted like ash. A woman of high status had told him, her voice trembling, that being with him felt like being interrogated by a ghost. You don't know how to be present, Tae-sung, she had whispered before leaving. You only know how to occupy space. He had accepted these failures as the price of his throne. He had built an empire to ensure he would never be weak, only to find that his strength had become a wall no one could climb. He had become a man who could order a city to its knees but couldn't keep a woman in his bed until morning. He turned away from the window, his gaze falling back on the guest suite where Nyla Bennett sat. She was the first person in years who hadn't looked at him as a monster to be feared or a prize to be won. She looked at him as a problem to be solved. As he stood there, the white fabric still clenched in his hand, the silence of the penthouse felt different. It wasn't the hollow quiet of a tomb anymore. It was the charged, heavy stillness that comes before a storm breaks. For the King of Shadows, the darkness was no longer a refuge. It was a challenge. Nyla didn't move as Tae-sung entered the room, though she was acutely aware of the shift in the air. The atmosphere in the penthouse always felt like a tightly coiled spring, but with him standing there, bare-chested and radiating a dark, restless energy, the tension became a living thing. She remained reclined against the headboard, the white satin sheets pooling around her waist like liquid silver. Against the pale fabric, her deep brown skin glowed with a soft mahogany luster, a striking defiance to the cold, monochromatic luxury of his world. She watched him with a steady, contemplative gaze that should have belonged to a judge, not a guest. Tae-sung was used to women who performed for him, women who giggled to mask their nerves or pretended to catch his favor. Nyla did neither. She looked at him the same way she looked at the priceless Joseon-era porcelain in his foyer, with a keen eye for detail and an unwavering search for the truth beneath the surface. Her long, dark curls fell over one shoulder, a chaotic, natural contrast to the sharp, geometric lines of his face and the rigid discipline of his physique. "You're late, Mr. Kong," she said softly. Her voice wasn't a challenge, but a simple observation of fact. "And you look like a man who has spent the night fighting ghosts." Tae-sung stiffened. No one spoke to him with such casual intimacy, let alone pointed out the weariness he fought so hard to hide. He was the master of this domain, yet Nyla's presence made him feel like an intruder in his own home. She had been here for 3 months as a consultant, a ghost in his halls, but tonight she was an anchor. She sat in the center of his private space, draped in his sheets, looking not like a conquest, but like a woman who was perfectly comfortable in the presence of a predator. He noticed the book beside her, a thick volume on ancient architecture, and the way her eyes lingered on his scars without the usual flicker of disgust or morbid fascination. It was a look of curiosity, yes, but it was edged with a deliberate distance, a boundary she had drawn that he couldn't simply buy or bulldoze his way through. "The rain caused delays," he replied, his voice regaining its habitual gravelly edge. He took a step toward the bed, his shadow stretching long across the silk. "I didn't expect to find you in my quarters. The locks are biometric and the power surged." "I'm trapped, not trespassing," Nyla countered, finally sitting up. The movement was fluid, graceful, and entirely devoid of fear. She met his sharp, narrow eyes with a look that was layered with unspoken emotion, a mixture of desire and a very clear warning that she was not to be handled. "But if you'd prefer I wait in the hall, I can find a cold marble floor to occupy." Tae-sung held his hand. For the first time, the King of Shadows found himself wanting to see what would happen if he didn't give a command. He wanted to know why this woman, who had every reason to be invisible, chose to stand so vibrantly in the light. Tae-sung took a final step, his presence looming over the edge of the bed like a storm cloud moving over a calm sea. He felt the familiar urge to reassert the hierarchy that had been the foundation of his existence since he was a boy in the gutters of Busan. He reached out, his large, calloused hand moving toward her chin, intended to tilt her face upward, a gesture of ownership, a silent command for her to acknowledge his status. But before his fingers could graze her skin, Nyla leaned back just an inch. It wasn't a flinch of fear. It was a deliberate denial of access. She looked at his hand, then back up into his eyes, her expression remaining as unreadable as the art she curated. "Is that the only way you know how to communicate, Tae-sung?" she asked, her voice low and smooth. "Through silence and touch that demands submission." Tae-sung's hand froze in midair. The use of his first name without his title was a puncture wound to his carefully maintained armor. He felt a flash of irritation, the instinct to growl a warning, to remind her exactly whose roof she was under. But as he looked at her, he realized that his usual methods, the cold stares, the looming physicality, were sliding off her like rain off glass. "I am used to being obeyed," he said, his voice a rough vibration in the quiet room. He slowly lowered his hand, his fingers curling into a fist at his side. "In my world, silence is a sign of respect." "In your world, maybe," Nyla countered, shifting her weight as she pulled the satin sheet higher over her shoulder, her movements deliberate and graceful. "But in mine, silence is just an empty room. You've filled this entire penthouse with beautiful things and expensive security, yet you move through it like you're afraid the walls will talk back. You didn't come in here to command me. You came in here because you're tired of being the only person in the world who doesn't have anyone to talk to." The precision of her words was more effective than any blade he had ever faced. She wasn't just refusing his command. She was dismantling the necessity of it. Tae-sung felt a strange, uncomfortable heat behind his ribs. He was a man of action, of swift executions and cold calculations, yet he found himself searching for words, actual words, to bridge the gap she had created. "I don't need a confessor, Ms. Bennett," he managed, though the lethal edge of his voice had softened into something closer to a rasp. "Good," she replied, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of her full lips. "Because I'm not a priest. I'm just a woman who isn't impressed by a bare chest and a scary reputation. If you want me to stay, stop acting like a boss and start acting like a man who knows how to hold a conversation." Tae-sung stood paralyzed by the sheer audacity of her requirement. He looked at the white fabric still clenched in his left hand, a shirt he had forgotten he was even holding. Slowly, he loosened his grip. For the first time in 15 years, the King of Shadows sat down on the edge of the bed, not to take, but to speak. The mattress dipped under his weight, a movement that felt significant in the heavy quiet of the room. Tae-sung sat on the very edge, his back a rigid map of muscle and old regrets, still refusing to fully relax. He looked at the shadows dancing on the marble floor, unable to meet Nyla's eyes now that he wasn't looking down at her from a position of power. "You have a beautiful home, Tae-sung," Nyla said, her voice dropping to a softer, more intimate register. She reached out, her fingers trailing lightly over the silk sheets, but her gaze remained on him. "But it isn't a home, is it? It's a tomb. A very expensive, very sterile vault designed to keep the world out, and you in." Tae-sung flinched, the words striking a nerve more sensitive than any physical wound. He looked around the room, seeing the cold perfection she described. The high-end finishes, the silent security, the lack of any personal clutter. It was a masterpiece of isolation. "I built this to be safe," he rasped, his voice sounding thin even to his own ears. "In my life, walls are the only things that don't betray you." "Walls don't just protect, they preserve," Nyla countered. "You've preserved yourself so well that you've forgotten how to breathe air that hasn't been filtered through a security system. You think the women before me left because they were afraid of your world. Maybe. But I think they left because they couldn't find a heartbeat in this museum of yours." Tae-sung finally turned his head, his sharp eyes searching hers. For the first time, he didn't look like a boss. He looked like a man who had lost his way in his own castle. He slowly reached up, not to grab her, but to trace a long, jagged scar that ran from his collarbone down toward his ribs, a mark usually hidden by the finest Italian silk. "This one," he whispered, his fingers trembling slightly, "was from my own brother, for a seat at a table I didn't even want yet. And this one," he pointed to a smaller mark on his forearm, "was for a lesson in silence I learned when I was 10. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for decades. The broken parts were finally laid bare, not as trophies of war, but as evidence of a profound loneliness. "I don't know how to be present, Nyla. I only know how to survive the next 10 minutes. Everything else is just noise." Nyla didn't pull away. Instead, she moved closer, the scent of her cocoa butter and warmth cutting through the cold bergamot of the room. She didn't offer pity, she offered a witness. For the first time, the King of Shadows felt the walls of his tomb begin to crumble, replaced by the terrifying, exhilarating light of being understood. The following night, the rain had tapered off into a silver mist that clung to the neon-lit streets of Seoul. Taesung didn't call for his usual armored convoy. Instead, he drove himself, his knuckles white against the leather steering wheel of a car that felt too fast and too loud for the quiet transition he was attempting. Beside him, Nyla remained silent, her presence a grounding force that smelled of vanilla and rain. She didn't ask where they were going. She simply watched the gleaming skyscrapers of the Gangnam district dissolve into the narrower, more crowded arteries of a neighborhood that time and money had forgotten. They stopped at the edge of a hillside village where the houses were stacked like discarded playing cards. Taesung led her down a steep alleyway, his tall, powerful frame looking out of place among the weathered brick and low-hanging power lines. He stopped before a small, nondescript restaurant tucked into a corner, its windows steamed over and smelling of fermented chilies and roasted sesame. "This was my mother's," Taesung said, his voice barely audible over the distant hum of the city. He didn't look at Nyla as he spoke, his gaze fixed on the fading wooden sign above the door. "Before the King of Shadows was born, I was the boy who scrubbed these floors until my fingers bled. I wasn't built in a boardroom or a combat ring. I was built here, trying to protect her from the men who came to collect debts we didn't owe." He pushed the door open, the bell chiming with a tinny, nostalgic ring. The interior was cramped and humble, a far cry from the marble-clad heights of his penthouse. An elderly woman behind the counter looked up, her eyes widening as she recognized the man who had become a legend of the underworld. Taesung didn't demand a table or issue an order. He simply bowed, a deep, respectful gesture that Nyla had never seen him perform. "I brought someone," he told the woman in soft, fluent Korean, before turning back to Nyla. They sat at a scarred wooden table in the back corner. Taesung's bare-chested bravado from the night before was gone, replaced by a quiet, raw vulnerability. He showed her the man who existed before the empire, the boy who loved poetry but learned to use a knife, the teenager who traded his soul to keep this tiny shop from being burned to the ground. "You asked me what I wanted," he said, looking at Nyla across the steam rising from 2 bowls of simple stew. "I thought it was power. I thought if I owned enough of the city, no one could ever hurt me again. But sitting here with you, I realize that power is just another wall. This," he gestured to the humble room, "is the only place where I ever felt real. And you are the only person who has ever looked at me and seen the boy who used to live here." Nyla reached across the table, her hand covering his. Her skin was a deep, warm contrast to his pale, scarred knuckles. In that moment, Taesung realized that true power wasn't in ruling the shadows, but in the courage to step out of them. The peace of the small hillside restaurant was shattered before they even stepped back into the penthouse. Taesung's phone vibrated against his thigh, a rhythmic, insistent intrusion that signaled a breach in the perimeter of his private life. He didn't have to answer it to know that the shadows he had tried to leave behind for one night had caught up to him. His jaw tightened, the lines of his face hardening back into the unreadable mask of the Mafia boss. The drive back was silent, but the air was no longer thick with vanilla and rain. It was sharp with a metallic scent of impending violence. When they reached the lobby, his head of security, Park, was waiting with a look that confirmed Taesung's darkest fears. "They were seen, boss," Park whispered, his eyes darting briefly to Nyla before returning to the floor. "The Shinhwa Syndicate had a tail on the car. They didn't move on the restaurant, but they photographed the girl. They know she's the reason you've been distracted." Taesung felt a coldness spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. For 15 years, he had been untouchable because he had nothing to lose. He had been a man of iron and stone, a king who ruled from a throne of ice. But as he looked at Nyla, standing by the elevator with her brow furrowed in concern, he realized the terrifying truth. He was no longer a fortress. He was a man with a pulse, and that pulse now had a name. Up in the penthouse, the tomb felt more like a cage. Taesung paced the marble floor, his movements predatory and restless. He watched the surveillance feeds on his wall, monitors showing the dark streets below where his enemies were undoubtedly circling, waiting for a crack in his resolve. "What is it?" Nyla asked, her voice cutting through his spiraling thoughts. She walked toward him, but he instinctively stepped back, the old habit of isolation snapping back into place. "You need to leave, Nyla," he rasped, his eyes fixed on a black sedan idling 3 blocks away on the monitor. "They saw us. They saw me look at you in a way I've never looked at anyone. In my world, that isn't a romance, it's a target." He realized then that his greatest failure wasn't the rejections in his bed. It was the fact that by opening his heart, he had painted a bullseye on the only person who had ever truly seen him. His invisible heart was now exposed, and the men who wanted his crown were already sharpening their knives to cut it out of him. The King of Shadows looked at the woman he was beginning to love and felt the paralyzing weight of a new kind of fear, the fear that his darkness would eventually swallow her whole. Tae-sung moved with the cold, rhythmic precision of a man preparing for war. In the center of his dressing room, he began to arm himself, the click of a Beretta's magazine and the subtle weight of a ceramic blade tucked into his boot being the only sounds in the suite. His eyes were flat, the warmth of the hillside restaurant extinguished by a familiar icy resolve. To protect Nyla, he was ready to burn the city. He was ready to remind the Shinhwa Syndicate why he was the King of Shadows, even if it meant burying his soul under another mountain of bodies. "So that's the answer." Nyla's voice cut through the silence, sharp and clear. She stood in the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, watching him transform back into a weapon. "You're going to go out there and prove them right. You're going to show them that the only thing you know how to do is destroy." Tae-sung didn't look up as he pulled on a black tailored jacket, his movements stiff. "They threatened you, Nyla. In my world, there is only one language for a threat like that. Violence is the only thing they respect." "Violence is the easy way, Tae-sung," she countered, stepping into the room. She didn't stop until she was standing directly in front of him, forcing him to meet her gaze. "It's the language of a man who's afraid to use his mind. You told me you wanted to be more than a legend. You told me you wanted to be real. A monster isn't real. It's just a nightmare people eventually wake up from." Tae-sung's jaw worked, his pulse drumming against the collar of his shirt. "If I don't strike, they will think I am weak. If they think I am weak, they will take you to get to me. Then don't be weak. Be brilliant," Nyla whispered, her hand reaching out to steady his trembling fingers as they gripped the edge of the dresser. "You own half the ports in this city. You have the leverage to ruin them without firing a single shot. Use the power you built to build a wall they can't climb, but don't do it with blood. If you go out there and become that monster again, you won't be protecting me. You'll be killing the man I finally started to know." Tae-sung looked down at his hands that knew how to break bones but were just learning how to hold hers. The choice hung between them, heavy and suffocating. He could choose the old language, the one of shadows and steel, or he could listen to the woman who refused to flinch. He looked at the gun on the dresser, then back at the fire in Nyla's eyes. For the first time, the King of Shadows realized that the greatest act of power wasn't taking a life. It was refusing to let his past define his future. Slowly, he reached for his phone instead of the weapon. "Park," he said into the receiver, his voice like grinding stones. "Cancel the strike. I want a full audit of the Shinhwa's offshore holdings. We're going to starve them out." The silence that followed Tae-sung's phone call was not the heavy, suffocating quiet of his usual isolation, but a soft, expectant stillness. He set the device down on the mahogany dresser, his hands no longer reaching for steel, but resting open and empty. The Shinhwa Syndicate was being dismantled by ledger lines and frozen assets, a bloodless execution that felt more like a rebirth than a conquest. He turned toward Nyla, the low, amber light of the room catching the tension still etched in his shoulders. For the first time, he didn't try to mask his exhaustion or project the invulnerability that had been his shield for a decade. He looked at her and saw not a prize to be protected, but a woman who had saved him from his own darkest instincts. "I've never done that before," he admitted, his voice a vulnerable rasp. "I've never let a threat go unanswered by force. It feels like standing in the middle of a field during a lightning storm without a roof. It's called trust, Tae-sung," Nyla whispered, moving into the small space between them. And it's a lot harder than pulling a trigger. She reached out, her warm palms cupping his face. Taesung closed his eyes, leaning into her touch with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 15 years of loneliness. The curse that had haunted his bed, the recoil of women who sensed the monster beneath the skin, was nowhere to be found. Nyla didn't flinch. She didn't look for a way out. She moved closer until her forehead rested against his, her breathing rhythmic and steady. When they eventually moved toward the bed, the dynamic had shifted completely. There was no calculated dominance, no performance of power. Taesung let himself be led, his movements slow and tentative, as if he were learning a language he had only ever heard whispered from a distance. For the first time in his life, he wasn't occupying space or commanding a body. He was sharing a soul, in the intimacy of the dark, with the city lights shimmering like distant diamonds through the glass. The King of Shadows finally found what he had lacked. It wasn't in the strength of his grip or the discipline of his body, but in the moment he allowed himself to be seen in his entirety. The scars, the fear, and the hope. As Nyla held him, her deep brown skin a warm sanctuary against his own, the coldness that had defined his existence finally thawed. He wasn't a legend or a boss. He was a man finally accepted, finally home. For the first time, Taesung didn't wake up in a tomb. He woke up in the arms of the woman who had changed everything. 3 years later, the morning sun over Seoul didn't feel like a spotlight on a crime scene. It felt like a blessing. Taesung stood on the balcony of a new home, one with floor-to-ceiling windows that stayed unlocked and rooms filled with the scent of Nyla's jasmine tea instead of sterile sandalwood and cold bergamot. The transition had been a slow, grueling climb out of the abyss. He had systematically dismantled his underworld holdings, converting them into a chain of global logistics hubs and high-end galleries that Nyla managed with the same calm brilliance she had used to save his life. The King of Shadows was a ghost story told in the back alleys of Busan now, a name that carried the weight of history rather than immediate terror. Taesung looked down at his hands. They were still strong, still calloused, but they were no longer clenched in the permanent white-knuckled grip of a man waiting for an assassin. He was a man who paid taxes, who mentored young artists, and who walked through the city without an armored convoy. He heard the soft padding of feet behind him. Nyla appeared at his side, leaning her shoulder against his. Her skin glowed in the early light, a rich, deep mahogany that still made his heart skip a beat after 1,000 mornings. She didn't look at him with the guarded curiosity of their first night. She looked at him with the effortless ease of someone who knew every corner of his soul and loved him more for the scars. "You're thinking again," she murmured, slipping her hand into his. "I can hear the gears turning from the kitchen." "I was thinking about the tomb," Taesung admitted, his voice now a warm, resonant baritone instead of a lethal rasp. He turned to her, his sharp, narrow eyes softening into an expression of profound peace. "I was thinking about how I used to be a ghost in my own life, and how you were the only one brave enough to hunt me down." "I didn't hunt you," she laughed, a sound that filled the open space with a music he had never thought he'd deserve. "I just refused to let you stay hidden." He pulled her into his arms, resting his chin on the crown of her dark, fragrant curls. The man who had once been rejected by every woman for his coldness was now a man who lived for the warmth of a single embrace. He was no longer a silent threat, a weapon in a tailored suit, or a king of a hollow empire. He was a husband, a partner, and a dreamer. In the city that had once known him only as a shadow, Kong Taesung was finally, completely, and utterly seen. And as he kissed Nyla under the vast blue Korean sky, he realized he wasn't just surviving the next 10 minutes anymore. He was living a lifetime. He was finally home.